I want to tell you something about the dress first. I made it myself. That is not a detail I offer for sympathy. I offer it because it matters to the story and because I want you to understand what kind of person I am before the ceremony starts. I am the kind of person who makes things with their hands when they care about them. I am the kind of person who spent 3 weeks on the embroidery at the hem because I wanted to do it right. I am the kind of person who had been courted for 4 months by a man I believed was honest and who prepared for the ceremony with the care that honest things deserve. I am also the kind of person who, when it becomes clear that the honest thing was not honest, does not collapse in the center of the ceremony floor. I looked at Darren Colt. I said, clearly enough for the front rows to hear, without raising my voice, because raising my voice would have given him something. I hope she knows what you are. Then I walked out. I want you to know that I did not cry until I was outside the gate. And then I cried for approximately 40 minutes in a very efficient and contained way. And then I picked up my brother, who had come to find me. And I said, we are going to Ashfen. And we went to Ashfen, and I have been there for 3 months, doing the things that needed doing and rebuilding the things that Darren Colt's calculation had removed. What I did not know, standing in the ceremony floor in my handmade dress, was that there was a gallery above me, and in the gallery was the man who oversaw the entire territory. And he had seen everything, and he was not planning to let it pass without consequence. I did not know this for 3 months, and then a man arrived in Ashfen, and my 6-year-old brother looked at him and walked directly up to him and said the thing that changed everything. My name is Sansa. Welcome to Sansa Romance Oracle. This is the story of a woman who was used as a demonstration and walked out anyway. A alpha who was watching and did not forget, and the 6-year-old brother who recognized something before his sister did and said it first. This story is completely original and exists only on this channel. Prologue. The ceremony floor. She entered at the correct time. That was the first thing. She had done everything right. She got to the preparation room at the right time. She had gotten dressed, been introduced, and walked onto the ceremony floor at the right time and in the right order, with the calmness that the event called for. There were a lot of people in the ceremony hall. 3 delegations from nearby areas came to visit, as well as the assembled cold water pack and the formal gallery where the observers sat. That morning, the alpha of the larger Voss territory had been announced. It was a routine visit, the kind that happened twice a year when the oversight structure needed formal presence. Maren hadn't seen him. She had been in the preparation room. She walked onto the floor. She stood in the center. She looked at Darren. He did not look at her the way she expected. He looked at her the way a man looked at something he had already decided about, with the particular flatness of a conclusion already reached. She understood in that moment, before he spoke, that something was wrong. He spoke. He announced to the assembled pack and the visiting delegations that after careful consideration of the pack's best interests, he was withdrawing from the candidacy with Maren Voss and declaring his intention to formally court Isla, daughter of the pack alpha, whose family's standing and connection to the Northern alliances made her the most suitable choice for a beta mate. He said all of this clearly and formally, and and with the smoothness of something rehearsed. He had planned it. He had planned it to happen after she was already on the floor. After she had already been presented in front of the delegations and the pack. So that it was not simply a change of intention. It was a demonstration of his power to choose and discard in public without consequence. She was the demonstration. She stood in the center of the ceremony floor. The hall was very quiet. She looked at Darren. He was already looking past her, toward Isla's family. She said, clearly, without raising her voice, "I hope she knows what you are." She walked out. In the public gallery, a boy of 6 had watched all of it. He had watched his sister walk in. He had watched the man's face. He had watched the announcement. He had watched his sister say the one true thing and walk out. He had climbed down from the gallery and gone after her. He had found her outside the gate. He had not said anything. He had simply taken her hand. She had held on. In the formal gallery above, a man sat very still. He had watched it all. His face showed nothing. His jaw was tight. He turned to his second and he said, quietly, "I want everything on Darren Colt. Everything. Every alliance, every calculation, every decision he has made in the past year. On my desk before I leave tomorrow." His second said, "Yes." He looked at the ceremony floor, where a woman in a handmade dress had been a demonstration and had walked out with her head up. He said, "And I want to know who Maren Voss is." His second said, "Yes." He looked at the floor for another moment. He left. He was going to handle this, not today, carefully, with the full weight of what his position allowed. He was going to handle it correctly. Chapter 1. Ashfen. Ashfen was a border village of approximately 300 people with a functioning market, a good well, and the specific quality of places that had been existing at the edges of things for long enough that they did not require anyone's notice to continue. Maren had been here before, briefly, on her way to survey work 2 years ago. She had remembered it as a place that did not ask questions. She needed a place that did not ask questions. She had arrived with Sable and 2 packs, and the money she had saved from her work as a textile consultant for 3 of the Eastern pack houses, which was enough to rent the small house on the north side of the village and to live while she established what came next. What came next had emerged over 3 months, with the practical inevitability of someone who was good at their work and had arrived somewhere that needed it. The village had no dedicated textile advisor. The village had, it turned out, significant trade in wool and linen that was being managed inefficiently because nobody had the specific knowledge to manage it well. Maren had that knowledge. She had it 3 months into her work when 2 of the larger village traders had come to her separately and asked if she would manage the winter contracts. She had said yes. She had restructured the winter contracts. The village traders had made more from the winter market than they had in 4 previous seasons combined. She had a position now, not formal, not titled. Simply the understanding that had grown from being useful. She was rebuilding. She was good at rebuilding. She tried not to think about the dress. She had made herself stop thinking about the dress after the first month. It had taken the rest of the month. Sable helped. Sable was 6 years old, and he had her parents' dark coloring and their mother's particular directness, and he had been her person since their parents died 2 years ago. He did not talk about the ceremony. He had, in the first week, said one thing. He had said, he did it on purpose. He waited until you were on the floor. She had said, yes. He had said, that is worse than if he had just changed his mind. She had said yes. He had said, he should not get away with it. She had said no, he should not. He had looked at her with the dark eyes. He had said, he will not. She had looked at him. He had said it with the certainty of a 6-year-old who had decided something. She had said, Sable. He had said, he will not get away with it. Things that are done on purpose have consequences. She had not argued. She had not known what he meant exactly. She had found out 3 months later. Chapter 2. The arrival. She was in the market on a Tuesday morning. She was at the wool traders' stalls checking the quality of the autumn clip against the contract specifications she had drawn up, which was one of the regular weekly tasks that had become part of her Ashfen routine. She was making notes. She was not paying attention to the road. Sable was. He was with her the way he was most mornings, nearby, doing his own observations. Usually something with the stalls, or the animals, or the particular study of whatever was happening at the edges of the market. He had a sharp eye and a longer attention span than most 6-year-olds, and the market provided him with considerable material. He went still. She noticed him go still. She looked up. A group of riders had come into the village from the northern road. 6 of them, well, equipped in the colors of the greater territory rather than any subsidiary pack. Official visit of some kind. The lead rider dismounted. Tall, dark hair. The controlled bearing of someone with authority who had been carrying it long enough to have settled into it, rather than performing it. She did not recognize him. She went back to her notes. Sable walked toward him. She said, Sable. He did not stop. She said, Sable. He kept walking. She abandoned her notes and followed. She reached him just as he stopped in front of the lead rider. He looked up at the man. The man looked down at him. Sable said, You are Kaiden Voss. The man said, Yes. Sable said, You were in the gallery. The man was very still. He said, Yes. Sable said, You saw what he did to my sister. The man said, Yes, I did. Sable said, Are you going to do something about it? The market around them had acquired the specific quality of a space that was paying careful attention while appearing not to. The man looked at Sable for a long moment. He said, That is why I am here. Sable said, Good. He stepped aside. He looked at Maren. He said, This is my sister. The man looked at her. She looked at him. She said, Carefully, Kaiden Voss, the Alpha. He said, Yes. She said, You were in the gallery. He said, I was. She said, 3 months ago. He said, Yes. She looked at her brother. Sable was watching the interaction with the focused assessment he brought to significant events. She looked at the Alpha. She said, You came here because of what happened at the ceremony. He said, That is part of it. She said, What is the other part? He said, Your name. She said, My name. He said, Voss. Maren Voss. He paused. My family name. The market continued around them. She said, Carefully, that is a coincidence. He said, I do not believe it is. She said, Explain. He said, The Voss line has a branch unaccounted for in the Eastern Territories for approximately 25 years. My grandfather's youngest brother settled east, and the families lost contact. He paused. I have been looking for that branch for 2 years. She said, You think I am? He said, I think you are family. Yes. She looked at her brother. Sable said, I knew. She said. You knew. He said. I knew he was important. He said it simply. I did not know the specifics. I just knew. She looked at the alpha. He looked at her. He said, I would like to tell you everything, if you will let me. She said, I need to finish the market notes first, he said. Of course. She said, you can come to the house at midday, he said. Yes. She went back to her notes. She was entirely composed. Her hands were not shaking. She was also thinking about a great many things simultaneously, and was managing this with characteristic efficiency. She finished the notes. She went home. She made tea. She waited. 2 Chapter 3 What he told her. He came at midday. Exactly midday. Not the managed 5 minutes late that showed you were not eager. Not the 5 minutes early that showed you were. Exactly the time stated. She noted this. She let him in. Sable was at the table. He had the expression he used when something important was happening that he was going to document thoroughly. The alpha sat across from her. He told her. He told her about the Voss line, the family history, the branch that had gone east with his grandfather's younger brother and had stopped corresponding 2 decades ago. The search he had started when he found the gap in the records. He told her that her grandfather had been that younger brother's son, that her parents had been the Eastern Voss line, that their death 2 years ago had been recorded in the territorial records, and that the recording of it was what had led him to the search. He told her that she and Sable were the last of that branch. She listened to all of it. She said, you have documentation. He said, yes. He produced it. She read it. She was a textile consultant who had restructured winter wool contracts. She knew how to read documentation. The documentation was thorough and correct. She set it down. She said, this makes you my. She paused. What does this make you? He said. Distant family. The connection is your grandfather and my grandfather as brothers. He looked at her. It makes me the head of the Voss line, which you are part of. She said, I have been using the Voss name for 6 years. He said, it is yours. You were not using a name that was not yours. She said, I did not know what it connected to. He said, no. She looked at the documentation. She said, why did you come here now? After 3 months. He said, I needed to be thorough before I came. He paused. And I needed to handle the other matter first. She said, Darren Colt. Said yes. She said, what did you do? He looked at her. He said, what would you like to know? She said, everything. Chapter 4 What he had done it carefully. This was his way with most things. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the full weight of his position, applied with precision to exactly the point where it would be most effective. He had returned to the capital 3 months ago with the file on Darren Colt that his second had assembled. He had read it thoroughly. What he found, Darren Colt's courtship of Maren, had been genuine for the first 2 months. Then the Alpha of Coldwater had approached him privately with the suggestion that a union with his daughter would significantly accelerate Darren's path to a senior position in the territorial administration. Darren had weighed this. He had decided the calculation favored the Alpha's daughter. He had then spent 2 months continuing to court Maren while simultaneously arranging the declaration for Isla. He had chosen the ceremony as the moment because it was witnessed, because it demonstrated his ability to discard a previous arrangement publicly without consequence, because it showed the Alpha's family that he was willing to make a statement on their behalf that cost him nothing except another person's dignity. He had used Maren as a demonstration of his own value. Kaiden had read this and been cold in the way he was cold when something had been done that could not be undone, and what remained was response. He had called Darren to the capital 6 weeks after the ceremony. He had not announced the reason. Darren had arrived expecting a routine administrative meeting. He had not gotten a routine administrative meeting. Kaiden had put the file on the table between them. He had said, "This is a record of what you did and why. I want you to know that I know." Darren had attempted to reframe it as a reasonable decision. Kaiden had said, "You used a public ceremony to demonstrate your value to the Alpha's family. The woman you used to make the demonstration had no part in your calculation, except as the material of it." Darren had said, "The political reality of." Kaiden had said, "Do not explain the political reality to me." He had said it quietly. Darren had stopped. Kaiden had said, "You are being reassigned to the Northern Survey posts. Administrative role. No ceremonial function. No public position. You will be there for 2 years. At the end of 2 years, your conduct will be reviewed." Darren had said, "The Alpha of Coldwater," Kaiden had said, "has been informed of the reassignment and its grounds. He has not objected." Darren had said, "Isla," Kaiden had said, "The declaration you made at the ceremony was a demonstration for an audience. It was not a genuine courtship declaration." He looked at him. "I expect you know the difference." Darren had said nothing. Kaiden had said, "You will leave for the northern posts within the week." He had left. Kaiden had then written to the Alpha of Coldwater. He had been specific about what the letter contained. He had been specific about the grounds of the reassignment. He had been specific about his expectation that Isla's family understood what Darren's conduct at the ceremony had demonstrated about his character. He had been specific about the fact that this letter was being placed in the territorial record. The Alpha of Coldwater had responded within 3 days. He had thanked the Alpha for the information. He had indicated that the courtship declaration with his daughter was being reviewed in light of the territorial record. He had indicated that he regretted the conduct at the ceremony. He had not said Maren's name. Kaiden had noted this. He had filed it. He had then spent the remaining 6 weeks completing the verification of the Voss family records. And then he had come to Ashfen. He told Maren all of this. He told it plainly and in sequence with the documentation available, if she wanted to see it. She listened to all of it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. She said, "You put it in the territorial record." He said, "Yes." She said, "Which means it is permanent." He said, "Yes." She said, "His conduct, the grounds of the reassignment, on the record." He said, "Yes." She looked at the table. She said, quietly, "He wanted to make it public." Kaiden said, "Yes." She said, "The whole point was that it was public." He said, "Yes." She said, "So you made the consequence public?" He said, "Yes." She looked up. He looked at her. She said, "That is." She stopped. She said, "That is exactly right." He said, "Yes." She said, "He wanted the demonstration. You gave him a different demonstration." He said, "I gave the record an accurate account of what happened and why." She said, "In the same form he used. Public. Permanent." He said, "Yes." She was quiet. She said, "Thank you." He said, "You do not need to thank me. What he did was wrong, and it was done in my territory at an event I was attending. It was my responsibility to address it, she said. You could have addressed it quietly, he said. He did not choose to do it quietly. She said no, he said. The public nature was the point. So the response needed to be public. She looked at him. He looked back, she said. You understood that? He said yes. She said, most people would have handled it as an internal matter, he said. Most people would have found the public response impolitic. She said, why didn't you? He said, because impolitic and wrong are different categories. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, how did you know which category it was in? He said, I watched you walk out. The room was very quiet, he said. I watched you stand in the center of that floor and say the one true thing and walk out. He paused. Anyone who could do that in those circumstances had a right to a response that matched what was done to them. She said, you decided that from the gallery. He said, in approximately 30 seconds. Yes. She looked at the documentation on the table. She looked at her brother. Sable had been very quiet through all of this. He was watching the alpha with the dark eyes. He said, you did what you said you would. Kaiden said, what did I say I would do? Sable said, I asked if you were going to do something about it. You said that was why you were here. He paused. You did it. Kaiden said yes. Sable said, good. He went back to his quiet observation. Maren looked at Kaiden. He looked at her. She said, you said the ceremony was part of why you came. He said yes. She said, and the family connection was the other part. He said yes. She said, is there a third part? He said, nothing for a moment. He said, it is early to say. She said, early for what? He said, early for the third part to have a name. She looked at him. He looked back. He said, I came because of the ceremony and the family connection. Those are the accurate reasons. He said, I also came because I have been thinking about the woman who said one true thing and walked out of that ceremony floor for 3 months. He said it simply. As fact. As the thing that was simply there whether he named it or not. She said, that is more honest than I expected. He said, I try to say accurate things. She said, most men in your position would not have said the third part. He said, most men in my position have more to manage. He paused. I have been managing things for 12 years. I am getting better at not managing things that do not need to be managed. She said, what does not need to be managed? He said, the third part. She looked at her hands. She said, I have been rebuilding for 3 months. He said, I know. She said, I am not finished. He said, I know. She said, I am not asking to stop rebuilding. He said, I am not asking you to. She said, then what are you asking? He said, nothing today. He said it directly. I am telling you what is true so that you have accurate information. What you do with it is yours to decide. She said, that is very careful. He said, you deserve careful. She looked at him. He held her gaze. She said, you should come to dinner. He said. She said, we eat at 6. Sable has opinions about the seating arrangement. Sable said, you sit across from each other. That is the right arrangement. They both looked at him. He said, it is better for conversation. He said it with the satisfaction of someone who had been thinking about this for approximately 40 minutes. Kaiden said, across from each other it is. Maren said, he said, I will be here. He was. Chapter 5 Dinner and After. He was there at 6. He sat across from her at the table where Sable had specified, and they had dinner in the way of people who have had a significant conversation and are now having an ordinary meal and are finding the ordinary meal easier than expected. Sable asked questions. He asked them with the directness he brought to most things, and without the diplomatic buffer that most children applied to conversations with unfamiliar adults. He said, "Do you have children?" Kaiden said, "No." He said, "Do you want them?" Kaiden looked at Maren. Maren said, "Sable." Sable said, "It is a reasonable question." Kaiden said, "It is." He looked at Sable. "Yes." Eventually, when the right circumstances present themselves, Sable said, "What are the right circumstances?" Kaiden said, "The right person." He said it simply. "That is the primary circumstance." Sable considered this. He said, "You have been looking for the family branch for 2 years." Kaiden said, "Yes." Sable said, "You found us." Kaiden said, "Yes." Sable said, "Are we the right circumstances?" The table was very quiet. Kaiden looked at Sable. He said, "You are family. That is separate from the other circumstances." Sable said, "Are they separate?" Kaiden said, "They do not have to be." Sable looked at his dinner. He said, "Good." He went back to eating. Maren kept her eyes on her food for a moment. Then she looked up. She said, "He does this." Kaiden said, "Does what?" She said, "Asks the questions that get to the point more directly than anyone expects." Kaiden said, "I noticed." She said, "He has been like this since he could talk." Kaiden said, "He is like your grandfather." From the family records, he was described as a person who asked the real question directly. She said, "My grandfather." He said, "The Eastern Branch records include correspondence. Letters from him to the main family line before they lost contact. He paused. He was the kind of person who wrote the actual thing rather than the diplomatic version." She said, "Where did we get it from?" He said, "I do not know. Some things simply come through." She said, "Did you know him?" He said, "He died before I was born. But I read the letters while I was looking." He stopped. He wrote my grandfather a letter that said, "I have gone east because the east is where the thing I want is. I would rather have the thing than the family role. I hope you get it. You will understand eventually if you don't now." She asked, "Did your grandfather get it?" He said, "Eventually." He was silent for a short time. By the time he knew enough to write back, the letters had stopped coming. She said, "That's too bad." He said, "Yes." He stopped for a moment. "It doesn't have to stay that way." She gave him a look. He said, "The connection has been found. What happens with it now is a different question from what was lost." She said, "You are saying forward." He said, "Yes." She said, "My grandfather would have liked that." He said, "I think mine would have liked yours." She said, "Yes, I think so too." Sable finished his dinner. He looked between them. He said to Kaiden, "You are going to stay in Ashfen for a while." Kaiden said, "For a few days. I have territorial obligations," Sable said. "But you will come back." Kaiden said, "Yes." "Often," Kaiden said. "As often as it is right." Sable said, "How often is that?" Kaiden said, "That depends on your sister." Sable said, "She is going to say yes." Maren said, "Sable." Sable said, "You are." He said it without apology. "You have been different since he arrived." She said, "I have known him for 6 hours," he said. "I know." She said, "That is not enough time to." He said, "You made the dress in 3 weeks because you cared about it." He paused. "You have been careful with caring about things since the ceremony," He looked at her. But you are different since he arrived. The table was very quiet. Kaiden looked at the table. He was not going to say anything. He was going to let this be what it was. She looked at her brother. She said, "You are 6 years old." He said, "Yes," she said. "You were very patient about this," he said. "I knew someone was going to come." He said it simply. "I just had to wait," she said. "How did you know?" He said, "Because what Darren did was wrong on purpose." He looked at her. "And things done wrong on purpose have consequences." He paused. "I just had to wait for the consequence to arrive." She looked at him. She said, quietly, "You walked up to him this morning." He said, "I recognized him." She said, "How?" He said, "He looked at you the right way when he saw you." She said, "What way?" He said, "Like you were important. Not like you were useful. Like you were actually important." She breathed. She looked at Kaiden. He was looking at the table. He looked up. She said, "You looked at me the right way." He said, "You were standing in a market making notes with your brother nearby, and you were entirely yourself, and yes." He held her gaze. "I looked at you the right way. I have been looking at you the right way for 3 months." She said, "From a letter and a family record." He said, "From watching you walk out of a ceremony floor with your head up." He paused. "Everything since has been," he stopped, "has been confirming what I understood in that moment." She said, "What did you understand?" He said, "That you were the kind of person worth coming to find." She looked at him. She said, "You came to find me." He said, "I came for the ceremony response and the family connection and the third part." "Yes," she said, "in that order." He said, "The third part was first." He said it plainly. "The other 2 gave me reasons to act on it." She breathed. She looked at her brother. Sable was satisfied. He had the expression he used for conclusions that had proceeded correctly. She looked at Kaiden. She said, "You have territorial obligations." He said, "I am here for 4 days." She said, "And then?" He said, "And then I return to the capital." She said, "And then?" He said, "And then I come back as soon as it is right." She said, "How often will that be?" He said, "As often as you want." She said, "That is very open." He said, "You are rebuilding. I do not want to arrive with a schedule and requirements." He said it directly. "I want to arrive when you want me to arrive and stay as long as you want and go when you need." He paused. "And I want to know you. All of it. The wool contracts and the house on the north side and the brother who asks the real question." She looked at him. She said, "That is the most accurate description of what I need that anyone has ever given me." He said, "I try to say accurate things." She said, "Yes, I know." She said, "Come back in 2 weeks." He said, 2 weeks. She said, "And we will see." He said, "Yes." She said, "Kaiden." He said, "Yes." She said, "Sable was right on the first morning." He said, "He usually is." She said, "He said you did what you said you would do." He said, "Yes." She said, "That matters." He said, "I know." She said, "More than the position and the name and all of it." He said, "I know." She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, 2 weeks. He said, 2 weeks. Sable finished the last of the bread. He said, "I am going to bed." He stood. He said to Kaiden, "Good night." Kaiden said, "Good night, Sable." Sable said, "Come back in 2 weeks." Kaiden said, "I will." Sable said, "Good." He went to bed. They sat at the table. The evening was quiet and the house was warm, and outside the border village continued its ordinary evening. She said, "He has been waiting for this." He said, "Since when?" she said, since the ceremony. He said Darren would not get away with it. He looked at me with the dark eyes and said things done on purpose have consequences. He said, he was right. She said, he is usually right. He said, how does he know things? She said, I have no idea. He has always been like that. She paused. Since he was very small. He said, how small? She said, when he was 4, he told our mother that the wall in the kitchen was going to fall down. He said he knew from the sound it made. He said, Anne. She said, it fell down 3 weeks later. He said, he hears the sound things make. She said, I think so. He said, that is an extraordinary quality. She said, it is also occasionally alarming. He said, yes, I imagine. She looked at him. She said, he knew you were coming. He said, he knew someone was coming. She said, he walked up to you in the market. He said, he knew me immediately. She said, he recognized something. He said, what? She said, I do not know yet. He said, but you will. She said, eventually. He said, you are not in a hurry. She said, I was in a hurry before. I made a dress in 3 weeks because I wanted it to be ready. He paused. She said, I am not doing that again. He said, no. She said, I am going to do this correctly. At the pace it should go. He said, yes. She said, 2 weeks. He said, 2 weeks. She looked at the table. She said, you put his conduct on the record. He said, yes. She said, permanently. He said, yes. She said he wanted the demonstration to be public. He said, yes. She said, and now the consequence is also public. He said, yes. She said, quietly, I stood in the center of that floor, and I said the one true thing, and I walked out, and I thought no one had heard it. He said, I heard it. She said, from the gallery. He said, I have been hearing it for 3 months. She looked at him. He said, I hope she knows what you are. He said it quietly, the way she had said it. That is the truest thing said in cold water in 3 years. She breathed. She said, you know what I meant? He said, yes. She said, she does not know what he is. He said, she is beginning to. She said, the territorial record. He said, yes. She looked at the window. He said, it will not undo what happened to you. She said, no. He said, nothing will undo it. She said, I know. He said, but it will not be something he keeps. He used it as a demonstration. He looked at her. He does not get to keep the demonstration. She said, no. She breathed. She said, thank you. He said, for what specifically? She said, for hearing it. From the gallery. He held her gaze. And for making sure it was not just words. He said, it was never just words. She said, no. It was not. They sat with the evening. Sable was asleep. The house was warm. She said, 2 weeks. He said, 2 weeks. She said, you are going to be here at exactly 2 weeks. He said, you know this already. She said, yes. He said, how? She said, because you arrived at exactly midday. He said, you noticed. She said, I noticed things. He said, I know. She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, good night, Kaiden. He said, good night, Maren. He left. She sat at the table. She thought about a gallery and 3 months and a man who had heard one true thing and had made sure it was not just words. She thought about a 6-year-old who had walked up to a stranger in a market and asked if he was going to do something about it. She thought about the dress. She thought about it for the last time. She was going to put it away now. Not because it did not matter. Because it had mattered, and the matter of it had been acknowledged, and that was as much as anything could be. She put it away. She looked at the table. She made herself a cup of tea. She was rebuilding. She was almost done. 2 chapters 6, 2 weeks and after. He was there at 2 weeks exactly. She had known he would be. She had also, and she was honest with herself about this, been watching the northern road on the morning of the 14th day. He came. He stayed 4 days. He came back 2 weeks after that, and 2 weeks after that. The pattern established itself with the specific regularity of something that had been decided and was simply being enacted. Between visits, there was correspondence. Not the sort of work that had anything to do with territory, but the other one. The sort that involved saying what you were thinking instead of saying what had to be said. He wrote about territorial work in terms of the particularity of wanting her to understand his reasons for doing what he was doing. She wrote about the Ashfen contracts and the market and Sable's chronic documenting of the world. She wrote about the dress one time. Not all of it, just the bit she kept back. She wrote about the dress once. Not the whole account, just the part she had been saving. She wrote, "I did not make it to be beautiful. I made it because I was going to be seen by people who mattered, and I wanted to be seen correctly. I did not know that correctly was going to mean standing in the center of the floor with nowhere to go." She paused in the letter. She wrote, "I do not regret what I said. I regret that it needed to be said." He wrote back the next day. He wrote, "You were seen correctly, not by the people you dressed for, by the one person in the room who understood what they were seeing." He wrote, "You needed to be seen correctly. You were." She read it 3 times. She filed it in the drawer where she kept the things that mattered. On the 6th visit, Sable said, "You should ask her." Kaiden said, "Sable." Sable said, "You have been coming for 3 months. She has been watching the northern road." He said it plainly. "It is time to ask her." Kaiden said, "These things take." As Sable said, "She is ready." Kaiden said, "How do you know?" Sable said, "The same way I know things." He said it simply. "She is ready." Kaiden was quiet. Sable said, "She put the dress away." Kaiden said, "How do you know that?" "She made me some tea that night after you left the first time, and she said she was putting it away. And she went into the chest in the corner room, and she stayed in there for a while, and when she came out, she was different." Sable said, "How?" Kaiden asked. Sable said, "More forward." He said it in the same tone their grandfather would have used, though he didn't realize it, as if she had laid something aside and her hands were free. Kaiden stared at the table. "You use your grandmother's word," he said. "Excuse me. She's full of forward. It's a family term, apparently," he said, staring at him. "How do you know what it means?" "I don't," he said, staring at his hands. "I just knew the word." Kaiden looked at the table. He said, "Your grandmother's word." Sable said, "What?" He said, "Full of forward. It is a family expression apparently." He looked at him. "How do you know it?" Sable said, "I do not." He looked at his hands. "I just knew the word." Kaiden looked at him. He said, quietly, "You are very like him." Sable said, "Like who?" He said, "Your great-grandfather. The one who went east." He said it the way you say things that are simply true. He paused. He was a person who knew things the way you know things, through the sound they made. Sable looked at his hands. He said, "Is that where it comes from?" He said, "I think so. I think some things come through." Sable was quiet for a moment. He said, "She put the dress away." Kaiden said, "I know." Sable said, "Ask her." Kaiden said, "Tonight." Sable said, "Good." He looked satisfied. He went to do whatever he had been doing. Epilogue. What was built from it 1 year later. The dress was still in the chest. Maren had kept it because it was quality work, and she had created it, and she did not throw away her own quality work. But she had pulled it out twice within a year, and each time, she had inspected it in the manner of a person who could look at a hurtful thing and assess it honestly. It was a fine dress. The embroidery on the hem was superb. She had designed it to be assessed rightly, and she had been assessed rightly. Only by the one person who truly counted. At a moment from a gallery above a ceremony floor, when she had not realized that someone of importance had been watching. She replaced it in its drawer. She was designing another garment now. She had been seen correctly by the one person who mattered. From a gallery above a ceremony floor at a moment she had not known anyone important was watching. She put it back. She was making something else now. Not a dress. Something else. Something she had been planning since the winter, with the same care she brought to things she cared about. 3 weeks into the planning, and she was not hurrying it, and she was not managing it, and she was simply doing the work at the pace it should go. She was good at this now, better than before. Sable was in the doorway. He said, "He is at the gate." She said, "He is early." Sable said, "He is always early now." She said, "He used to be exactly on time." Sable said, "He is getting less managed." She smiled. She said yes. She went to the gate. Kaiden was there. He was early. She said, "You are early." He said, "I know." She said, "You are getting less managed." He said, "I am practicing." She said, "How is it going?" He said, "Reasonably well." He looked at her. "I was thinking about you on the road and I rode faster." She said, "That is very honest." He said, "I am trying." She said, "You rode faster because you were thinking about me." He said, "Yes." She said, "How far out were you when you started thinking about me?" He said, "I started thinking about you when I left the capital." She said, "That is a long ride." He said, "Yes." She said, "You have been thinking about me for 2 days." He said, "I frequently think about you for several days at a stretch." He said it without apology. "That is accurate." She looked at him. He looked back. She said, "Come in." He said, "How is Sable?" She said, "He told me you were going to be early approximately an hour before you arrived." He said, "How did he know?" She said, "He heard something." He said, "The sound things made." She said, "Yes." He shook his head with the expression he used for Sable. The specific helpless warmth that had developed over 12 months of Sable, knowing things before they happened. She said, "He put the name on it." He said, "What?" She said, "What you said about my great-grandfather, full of forward. He uses it now." She paused. "He says it about you sometimes." He said, "About me," she said. "He says you are full of forward now. He said it started on the 6th visit when you asked me." He said, "And before that," she said. "He says you were full of managing." He said, "He is not wrong." She said, "No." They went inside. Sable was at the table with his notebook. He looked up. He said, "You were early?" Kaiden said, "Yes." He said, "I knew you would be." Kaiden said, "I know you knew." Sable said, "She is making something." Kaiden said, "I know." Sable said, "You know?" Kaiden said, "She wrote to me about it." He paused. "I have been thinking about it for 2 days." Sable looked at him. He said, "It is going to be good." Kaiden said, I know. Sable looked at his notebook. He said, she made the dress for people who did not see her correctly. Kaiden said, yes. Sable said, she is making this for people who do. He said it the way he said things that were simply true. He went back to his notebook. The house was warm. Outside the border village of Ashfen did its ordinary business. Inside the house there was a chest with a dress that had been made with care and was kept because good work was kept. There was a drawer with letters in it. There was a boy of 7 now who heard the sound things made and knew them before they arrived. There was a woman who had been a demonstration and had said the one true thing and walked out and had been building since. There was a man who had heard it from a gallery and had not forgotten it and had arrived exactly at midday and early after that and had been practicing, less managed for a year, and was getting better at it. There was something being made, carefully, at the right pace. Something that was going to be good because it was being made for the right people with the right care. She was good at making things. She always had been. She had just needed the right person to see them correctly. She had him now. She was going to make things for a very long time. That is the end of the Alpha humiliated her at the mating ceremony. She did not know the Alpha was watching. If the moment Sable walked up to a stranger in the market and said, are you going to do something about it? If a 6-year-old asking that question on his sister's behalf did something to you, you are the person I make these stories for. My name is Sansa. Hit subscribe. You won't miss the upcoming stories. Bye, take care.